You've tuned into Prepare, Defend, Lead. My name is Joe Prim. For this episode, I dug deep into the archives of my previous podcast, Ever Vigilant, and pulled out one of my favorite episodes titled A War on Men that I recorded with Paul Curtman. It's one of my favorite episodes that I recorded for that podcast. So if that sounds interesting to you, stick around and I'll catch you on the other side of the intro.
The comfort and distractions of today collide to indulge our desires and provide a slow death by apathy. A superior primitive ethos exists. Prepare for tomorrow. Defend what you value and lead those you love. This mindset is the foundation of living an authentic life as a bold, disciplined man resolute in your mission. Prepare, defend, lead. Your mission. Own it.
All right, guys, welcome to yet another episode of PDL. I do appreciate you letting me along for the ride. Not sure what you're doing today, whether you're on your commute or doing yard work or just chilling out in the backyard around a fire or raking leaves, whatever you happen to be doing today. Thank you for hanging out with me. Thank you for allowing me and my story and my thoughts and these interviews to be a part of your life. My intent with all of this is to fuel that fire that burns within you, to bring those embers to a red-hot glow as you become an inferno for your purpose, for who you are serving, to become the father, the husband, and the leader in your community that you can be. So I have a confession to make before I start this episode. I'm actually very frustrated, but the last two interviews that I have done, I have lost or screwed up the audio. I would like to blame the internet connection here at our new place, but I will take responsibility. I will figure out what the issue is and resolve it. The episode that I recorded this last week, I had a great conversation, and one of my favorite things about doing this podcast has been given me the opportunity to get to know new people that I never would have had the opportunity to meet. And many of the opportunities that I have had to do interviews have led to some great friendships, and this conversation that I had this week with a gentleman named Rick Bennett was just such an opportunity. A very, very interesting story that he has to tell. Traded in a solid career as a graphic designer to serve his community and serve people in a much different way by getting into law enforcement. And then once he got into law enforcement, he realized that there was yet another way that he could serve that new community that he was a part of. And he wrote a devotional called Send Me for law enforcement, first responders, and military personnel. So we had a really great conversation on what motivated him to get into law enforcement and what really motivated him to write this devotional. I will be hopefully doing another recording with him so you can hear his story firsthand, but since I messed up that audio, I did want to mention it. I will put a link to that devotional in the show notes for this podcast. Again, it's called Send Me by Rick Bennett. I would highly recommend it. Again, what an opportunity to talk to somebody that sacrificed and giving up things in order to serve a purpose and a cause bigger than themselves. So hopefully we can get something on the calendar and we can re-record that episode and have that conversation once again. But until then, go check him out and check out his book, Send Me. The other one that I messed up is actually the gentleman that I do this, that I had recorded this episode with. several years ago, probably back in 2018. And this is one of my favorite episodes. It is really interesting as Paul gets into the history of King Cyrus and the war on men that went on at that point in history. And we really dig deep into corresponding what went on in history and how it was repeating itself as we looked out into what was going on in our world at that time. Again, this podcast is from several years ago, so some things are going to seem a little bit different, and maybe things that we could have brought up or would have been brought up in the podcast that had been recorded within the last 6 months would have been much different. But again, this is one of those conversations that will last forever because it's based on history. Again, I messed up that recording or lost it or not sure exactly what happened again with that audio. I will need to get back together with Paul once again because he is just so smart and so well versed in the history of this country and the thoughts and ideas behind freedom and liberty and how important they are and how they affect us in our daily lives, and especially as we move forward into a crazy unknown future. So, as always, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for taking me along for the ride, whether you're on your commute or doing some fall chores out in the backyard. I appreciate you letting me come along, share my thoughts, share my opinions, and share some great conversations that I have had with some great men. The idea behind this podcast really is to fuel those embers that are burning within you. Sometimes those embers get covered up with fears and the lies and the expectations of other people, and they lay dormant for years at a time. The idea behind this podcast and my book and my presentations and the different things that I do here with PDL is to fuel that fire so that hero can rise again within you. So that hero can rise again and you can serve your community and your family as the hero that they need, but also the hero that you expected to become as a young boy. I believe that all of us as boys looked up to these heroes and wanted to be like them because we wanted to serve. We wanted to lead. We wanted to overcome evil. And with our modern society and our culture, the way it's built, we get bogged down and we get caught up in things that don't matter, that aren't as important. And we get pulled in to an apathetic, easy life. And that has consequences. So the idea behind this podcast and the other things I'm doing is to feed that fire and to lead you and help guide you into a place where you can become the father, the husband, and the leader that you want to be and that those around you deserve. I left the intro and the outro from this podcast, the original podcast here on for you guys. Some of you guys have been listening to me for a long time, and I thought it'd be kind of fun to leave the original Ever Vigilant intro and outro on the podcast. So let's jump into it.
Recorded at an undisclosed location known only as the Homestead, you've tuned into Ever Vigilant. Our mission? To encourage and challenge men to prepare, defend, and lead at home and in their communities.
You've tuned in to Ever Vigilant. I'm your host, Joe Prim, and this is the podcast where I get to talk with veterans and artists and authors and first responders, pastors, podcasters, security experts, small business owners, and everything in between, because Ever Vigilant is where these great men and their knowledge collide. And here we go with another episode of Ever Vigilant. This time around, I get to bring a conversation that I had with Marine veteran and Missouri statesman Paul Curtman. Normally, before I record this intro to the podcast, I have just spent several hours editing the podcast, tweaking it, trying to get it as cleaned up as I can with my talent level. And the one word that I will use to describe this conversation was intense. Paul is an intense guy. He's a passionate guy because he's not preaching somebody else's sermon. These are ideas and thoughts that he has developed over time. They are deep passions, and you can tell that when he speaks about the war on men and manliness and masculinity, that it's something that is bothering him in a deep level, something he's thought about, something he's spent time praying about, something that is deep within him that comes pouring out as he talks on these topics. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. We talk about everything from the article that really led to me finding him and looking him up and trying to get him on the podcast, an article called A War on Men, King Cyrus's Guide to National Enslavement. That is a great article. Be sure that you go to his website, paulcurtman.com, and read that article. If you like that, make sure you subscribe on his website there. But phenomenal article. We get an opportunity to talk about that, and it's a story about King Cyrus, the guy from the Bible, but written from a different vantage point from the histories of Herodotus. So we dive a little bit deeper into that story and why he wrote about it and what he feels about it. Talked a lot, too, about men and the pitfalls that men in our modern society are falling into, and the reality that most of those pitfalls are really nothing new. The other thing we talked about, just as equally as those pitfalls, is ways to become that better husband, that better father, that better leader in your home and in your community that you need and should want to become. Again, I really enjoyed our conversation. I hope to have Paul back on Ever Vigilant again, because I think he has a lot of sound thoughts that go lockstep in what I believe here and Ever Vigilant. I know those that listen to the Guerrilla Traffic cast are wondering kind of what's going on. I've kind of left some suspense in the air on the last few episodes about some different things that are in the works and going on in my personal life. I will be opening up real soon here and sharing exactly what's going on with you all, because for me that is part of the whole commitment to this new direction. Thanks, guys, for listening. I hope you enjoy this episode with Paul Curtman.
Spartans! What is your profession?
See, old friend, I brought more soldiers than you did.
With that out of the way, let's jump into this conversation.
All right. My name is Paul Curtman, and when I was 17 years old, I enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. I was an infantry squad leader, and after about 10 years between active duty and reserve, I finally came home and finished college and went to work a little bit in the financial industry before running for political office. I won my election in a district everybody said I wasn't going to win, knocked on lots of doors, worked really, really hard, won over the people of the area, and served 8 years in the Missouri State House of Representatives, was the chair of several committees, and currently still working there as a policy advisor for a state senator. And so that's kind of in a nutshell, just a little bit of my personal and professional background. My father is a pastor, and so I grew up in a Christian home. And I got 5 brothers and sisters, and God's blessed me with a great life. Currently married with 2 kids and 1 on the way.
It's always a different life experience when there's 1 on the way.
Yeah, no doubt about it. A lot to look forward to.
My kids are just a little bit older, 8 and 10, so it's been cool lately. It seems like I've come across several different guys that are, have one have one on the way, and there's just this sparkle in the eye and this special smile on a guy's face when he knows that there's another one on the way. It's kind of cool.
Yeah, definitely. We're really excited about it.
I don't know how long I've been following you, Paul, on Instagram, but at some point as I was flipping through, you caught my attention and I noticed that you had a blog. So it was one evening and I thought, you know what, I'll check out what this guy's writing about. And you had written a post on your blog about King Cyrus. And man, it just really hit home for me. And I don't think I had finished writing or reading through your blog post, and maybe 5 minutes passed before I messaged you and said, you know what, would you be interested in coming on the podcast? Because the article is so simple, but yet at the same time so relevant to what we see going on today. Give a little bit of the story about what went into that and what you see going on.
Sure. Well, I'll just get into the article a little bit. So I grew up in a household, like I said, my father is a pastor, but he's also a history teacher. And so when I grew up, I had this it was kind of instilled in me at a young age to just really appreciate history and read it and learn from it. And so I've taken a lot of history classes in college and then in graduate school. And I had been reading from the histories of Herodotus. And there's a story in there where Herodotus is talking about the birth of who we know today as King Cyrus. This is the same King Cyrus in the Bible that dealt with Daniel. Okay, same King Cyrus. So this is a real historical figure. And Herodotus tells the story about how King Cyrus, being this great conqueror from Persia, goes into the land of Lydia, which is where modern-day Turkey is. And he goes in and he conquers the people. Now, King Cyrus was a really smart guy. He was very politically savvy, and he knew that once you conquer people, what you should do is you should promote people from within your conquered territory to offices in your empire. It'll instill loyalty. It'll give people buy-in to you as their new leader. So King Cyrus goes into Lydia. He conquers the Lydians. He conquers a king called Croesus. Croesus was very famous for his wisdom and also for his wealth. Cyrus comes in, conquers all of Lydia. And as he's deciding who he's going to appoint to different positions, he hires this guy named Pactius, who's also a Lydian. And he tells Pactius, here's what I want you to do, Pactius. I want you to be in charge of all of Croesus's gold. So while I'm off on this next military campaign, I want you to be in charge of the wealth of this part of my new empire, the Lydian part. King Cyrus takes King Croesus with him as a military advisor. And they're probably about 2 weeks out of town on their way to the next military campaign when one of Croesus's messengers comes riding into camp, full speed, and he says, King Cyrus, you're not going to believe what's going on. This guy Pactius that you hired to be in charge of all the wealth, well, he's not on your team. He's still very much against you, reigning over Lydia. And so he took all the gold in Lydia and he went down to the coast and hired a bunch of mercenaries, and he is right now trying to mount an insurgency to conquer you. So King Cyrus, in kind of this moment of bewilderment and desperation, says, when are these people going to learn? And I'm paraphrasing here. He says, when are these people going to learn? I tried to help them out. I conquered them, yes, but I've also been very good to them. I've promoted them within their own kingdom. I guess there's nothing left for me to go back and enslave them all. King Croesus hears this. And, he's a Lydian, so he loves Lydia. And he says, King Cyrus, everything you said is absolutely true. However, don't go back and enslave them all just because of this one guy. He said, if you want to make sure that these people never mount a rebellion or an insurgency, if you want to make sure they never stand up and fight, there's a couple things you can do. And this is really the crux of the history story here. He tells Cyrus, he says, take away your weapons of war. He says, teach the young boys to play the flute and tend shop and make them wear soft slippers on their feet. And then he gets to the point and he says, and then, King Cyrus, you will soon see their men turning into women, and they will never be a problem for you ever again. And the histories by Herodotus say that King Cyrus was really pleased with this kind of advice, because I think it's advice that he got that taught him how to pacify people without actually taking over them and putting them actual in physical chains of bondage. So King Cyrus was pleased with this information, and that's exactly what he did. He went back to Lydia, and he just completely altered the culture and used the law to enforce it. And that's exactly what happened. The Lydians never posed another problem to King Cyrus. And so I wrote this article after I read this because I'm thinking to myself how relevant that story is to what's happening today in our culture. We have men who are losing every ounce and degree and identity of their masculinity, and all it's really doing, as far as men are concerned, is it is enslaving not just us, but also our families and also our nation. And so that history story really spoke to me, which is why I wrote that article that you mentioned and you brought me on to talk about.
Thanks for going through that story again there, Paul, because like you said, it's so obvious that you see what's going on here in our society once again. You broke down really well in your article the whole idea of well, there's three things, right? There's the weapons of war, which is obvious and blatantly going on right now. But the one that you went pretty in-depth into that might be a little bit more difficult for some people to understand would be the soft shoes. Can you go into that a little bit and what really was meant behind this whole soft shoes issue?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So actually what Herodotus says was that the advice was to make the Lydian men wear tunics under their cloaks and wear soft slippers on their feet. And this would have done a couple of things. Number one, tunics underneath their robes is a much more careful consideration to your clothing and your garment and fashion and underwear, and everything that might be considered delicate about you that speaks through your clothing. And then the soft slippers on your feet. I spent 10 years with the Marines between active duty and reserve as an infantryman. And I can tell you that we're taught to be very careful with our feet. Because if you lose the ability to use your feet on the battlefield, you have essentially taken yourself out of the fight. And so by forcing the men to wear soft slippers, go out and try running down an assault range, down a rifle range, doing some training in an urban area, or having to run over some gravel with soft slippers on your feet. You're going to move a lot slower. It's going to be really painful, and you're going to be really careful about where you step. And I think that we live in a culture today that's telling men you have to wear essentially soft slippers on your feet. You don't want to say that because you're a bigot. You don't want to say that because if you say that, then that means you're just a male chauvinist. And so what is this culture doing to men? It's telling men, keep your mouth shut. Walk around like you have soft slippers on your feet. Be very careful where you step. You're not allowed to come in here like you mean business. You have to be really, really careful and sensitive and compassionate to everybody else. And if you're not thinking about all of us, every step that you take, then you're wrong. And I think it's worked. Our culture has done this to men, and I really think that it's worked. We have men that have ceased being men. In fact, it wasn't the histories, but there's a Greek historian who said, thus from the renowned warriors, the Lydians became the least warlike of men. Why? Because they were forced to wear soft slippers on their feet. And I see a cultural correlation here with men today who are submitting themselves to a culture that tells them to quit acting like men. And I think just like the Lydians, how it enslaved them because their men were no longer ready and prepared to fight, we have a culture who's telling men quit acting like men. And you know what? Men and women are different. We are different, and it's okay for these differences. And as a Christian, I think that both men have glory in the differences that they have from men and vice versa. And but what we let this culture do is we let them strip us of our masculinity. And there are some times in our families' lives, and there's some times in our nation where our nation, in our families, and our sons and our daughters need men to stand up and start acting like men. But we're losing that. We're losing that warlike ability in terms of our masculinity because we've submitted to a culture that tells us to walk around on eggshells. And we've seen it play out in history. And so nothing's new. This stuff has been written throughout millennia. Nothing is new, and there's a lot that we can learn from here.
The reality is, we've become a culture where the men are sitting at home on the couch or sitting in the recliner watching sports and watching other people do warrior type things, right? Or playing video games, right? And doing virtual warrior type things rather than investing themselves in their future and investing themselves back into the future of their children and investing themselves into their wives by actually being active and doing things. And I was listening to a pastor recently, and he was talking about this whole shoes issue too. And what he was saying is that really it was only soldiers that wore shoes back 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. It was only soldiers that wore shoes because they needed them. And the slaves were barefoot, and everybody else that kind of fell someplace in between there could wear sandals. So there's a huge dichotomy there just in the footwear that I don't think we as modern people even think about anymore, just because footwear has evolved through the years to mean something completely different. We could even go into a little bit about the playing the lute and tending shop, because once again, it mirrors exactly what's going on in our society, where the percentage of, I was just reading it the other day, the percentage of men and women going into the armed forces is, I think, less than 7% of our population. And now, in the past, the majority of people, whether they entered the armed services or not, had somebody, a close relative that had served. And even that number is diminishing in great, great numbers. And what I'm starting to see in our culture and in our society is those that did serve are really standing out in a different way than a lot of the other men in our society and in our culture. And I think that it's becoming more and more obvious, and frankly, I think it's probably really starting to piss off a lot of people, because you all that served understood and understand what it means to be a man, to stand up, to actually understand what it means to fight for something. Can you get a little bit into that kind of dichotomy of what that difference is, having spent time overseas fighting, and what that does for somebody in their understanding of what masculinity truly is, especially historically, but even more so now, I think.
Yeah, I got some thoughts on that. I'm going to put this as carefully as I can. I think that joining the military, for me, when I enlisted when I was 17 years old, I think what it did for me, and I'll speak from my experience, it gave me an opportunity to actually exercise what I already knew about what it means to stand up and engage in the fight and exercise some initiative and some leadership. I know that there are people out there that, I got some friends that would have loved to have had the opportunity to serve, but for one reason or another, maybe it was a family commitment, maybe it was they had another calling on their life, they didn't, and that's totally fine. And they have exercised leadership and masculinity in that way. In other words, exercising self-ownership and knowing I am responsible for my actions, and I have to own all my decisions. And so they stood up and they owned the decision to stay home and take care of their family, because that was their priority. That was their mission. But when I was 17 years old and being young and single, I had an opportunity to join the military and really learn some things. The practical application of integrity and selflessness, and having to put that into action at 18 and 19 and 20 and 21 while I was on active duty, really showed and demonstrated to me at a very young age how important it was and what it actually looks like when you see it in action. And I think if you compare that to I hate to use the word men. I think we use that word so loosely today, but if you compare that to some males today, and what they do is after high school, they're just looking for the next easy ride to the next free meal. And they wind up sitting at home and playing video games. And I think that there's some males they sit at home on the couch and they play things like Call of Duty and Medal of Honor, and they don't have the slightest clue what those things actually mean. They're just video games to them. But when you've had an opportunity to step up and really put your neck out on the line because you knew something needed to be done, you knew somebody needed to step up, you knew somebody needed to enlist, you knew somebody needed to get in the way of something else in order to protect other people, when you've had an opportunity to do that and you own it and you know it, it'll change your life. And it really helps instill even a deeper sense of duty. So that way, as you go on through life and you leave the Marine Corps, you leave the Army or the Navy or the Air Force or whatever at 22 or 23, well, when you're 24 years old and you're in college, you look at your studies a lot differently than you probably would have when you were 17. You look at making sure you dress appropriately to go to that job interview because it's a personal sense of pride. And you know that you do not want to let down the other men who came before you to give you the opportunity to go off and do that. You know that when you look in the family, I think there's a country song that talks about this. You look in the family, you see all your relations that you've ever had in your face, and it begins to mean something. And so having been the opportunity to serve my country in that way has done an awful lot to further instill a lot of this stuff and make me much more self-aware of these types of principles and this type of character. And I just really wish that we had a culture that didn't seem to be at war with those types of things.
Yeah, I really, for me, it seems to really what it comes down to is being put to the test. And the lack of men in our culture and society ever being put to the test. And I think that maybe is the line where it is. It's not necessarily going to the military. That's one way to be put to the test. But in the past, every man that survived through childhood, through adolescence, and became a man had survived something, whether it was a famine or plague or war or some sort of violence. Everybody had kind of passed a test of maturity. And I suppose that goes into even to our lack of rites of passage in our culture these days, where when you lack that true test to prove who you are as a man,
you miss out on the identity. That's part of the rite of passage. Those rites of passage give you identity, and I think that's I know exactly where you're going, if I'm not mistaken.
No, exactly. And you miss out on that self-confidence that comes from being put to the test and coming out that other side a better person. And I think that is a huge part of what is missing right now in our culture.
Entirely agree. Could not agree more.
And then we can go back to your story again, and then we could argue whether that's intentional or not. Right, Paul?
Yeah, and I think it is. I read a book one time that talked about the process of history. And it says that things that are worth fighting for don't happen by accident, right? Like America just didn't happen by accident. Some people had to take action and say, hey, we're going to throw off this tyrant, King George III, because we've always been free. We intend to stay free. If things like that happened by accident, well, then accidentally people would just make millions of dollars because they accidentally invented a new supercomputer, right? Like things like that don't happen by accident. You don't have great people by accident. Things are done on purpose, and that goes both ways. I want to be a real man and give my sons an example of what a real man looks like. That's a real responsibility that I think is often overlooked. The fact that as a father, I have influence on two little boys who one of these days are going to be leaders of families, churches, businesses, communities. Maybe they're going to go up and go further than I did in politics. Who knows? And so I have an opportunity here to really show some influence. And if I'm going to do it right, it's not going to happen by accident. I have to invest myself into it. I have to measure it and scale it. And that forces me to make sure that I'm, constantly reflecting. Which is why I keep a journal. You got to constantly reflect because you always want to look back. It's like the psalmist said, right? Search me, O God. And we have to search ourselves too and make sure that we're doing things the right way. And if we realize that we're not, we need to change. We need to adjust the way we think and adjust our actions accordingly so that we can continually do better.
Yeah, I think you hit on exactly why self-evaluation is a spiritual discipline. It is so necessary to each and every day look back and question, well, why am I feeling this way about this? Why did this upset me? Should have it upset me, or should have it not upset me? Should have I just been able to let that roll off my back? Is it something that I need to address later on? Did I flush out that situation with that other guy? Did it end on a good note? Did it end on a bad note? How do I proceed from there? But if you don't spend that time, like you're talking about, journaling or self-reflecting back over something, how can you grow? How can you know where you need to make your changes, and how can you improve? And like you went into too about the responsibility for your sons, and that is a tremendous responsibility that far too many of us have dished off to other people. I know so many men who are paying big money and working a lot of overtime to pay some other man to teach their son how to pitch a baseball or how to hit or how to shoot a basketball. And those are men missing out on the opportunity to be that true example and that true mentor for their own son.
Yeah, that's right. I just recently put up a new post on my blog where I talk about making your actions count towards something, making your efforts count towards something. And the quote that I have is from Seneca. Seneca was a great Roman statesman, and he said, "Let all your efforts be directed to something. Let it keep that end in view. It is not activity that disturbs people, but false conceptions of things that drive them mad." And what Seneca is really doing is he's speaking to the point, like, if you want to live intentionally, you have to reflect. You have to know exactly what the final end product is, and you need to work towards it. And if you're distracted by other things, then you need to stop doing those things, and you need to reevaluate, readjust, and make sure that you get back on track. And I think that as men, that's something that's really important, especially in the culture that we have today, because we live in a world that's constantly trying not to tell us not to be masculine. They're trying to redefine masculinity. Like, you can go open up any magazine that popular culture wants to throw at you, right? And you're going to see men. Let me just put it this way. I've always told men younger than myself, maybe from my church, I'm not big into like fashion, you know? And I recently was listening to a podcast where this guy was interviewing this so-called expert on men's dress. And the guy started talking about all the skinny pants that he wears, right? And I immediately was like, well, this is a total waste of my time. And I turned it off. And the reason is because if you're a man and you're going to live intentionally, you have a responsibility to protect not just yourself, but your family. And you should never wear clothes that are so tight and restrictive that you can't throw a punch or a kick, right? Without them. You don't want to wear clothes that are so tight because you're trying to be fashionable that you lose all your range of mobility. But culture is telling men, wear capris. Wear these short, super tight pants that come halfway up your calf, and wear them with dock shoes and sunglasses and a skin-tight blue blazer with a white T-shirt, and you'll look really cool. You'll look really hip. You know what? If I ever get mugged, I hope it's by a guy wearing skinny pants, because it's going to make it a whole lot easier to take them out. You know what I'm saying? But this is the world that we live in that's constantly trying to redefine what masculinity is, and it has it all wrong. A lot of it has to do with self-ownership, understanding our responsibilities, and always making sure that we're prepared and reflecting and reevaluating to make sure that we're always in the right place as men and doing the right things to be better men.
And there, Paul, lies in the challenge, because it's a daily challenge then. And if you're going to live intentionally like that, you have to be up for the challenge on a daily, on an hourly, on a minutely basis to step up to bat when your daughter comes and asks you a question that you really don't feel like answering, or when your son wants to do something that you don't think he should do. Instead of just flipping over to the remote to a different channel, you've got to engage this situation. If you actually care about your wife, if you actually care about your children, if you actually care about whoever else is in your neighborhood or whoever else is in your circle of influence, if you actually care, you need to get engaged and get involved in what's going on. It's way too easy these days because there's so much going on. We live in a world full of chaos and apathy and all that stuff. Mediocrity is totally acceptable. Whereas, 50 years ago, it wasn't. Now, all of a sudden, mediocrity is actually, I think, preferable, because when you see everybody else is mediocre, it takes all the pressure off of you to do anything more than sit back in your own pool of apathy and patheticness. But if you are going to be that man of intent like you're talking about here and like you're describing here, it's a game that doesn't shut off. It's continual. But that's the exciting part. That's always living up to the challenge. That means that life is always coming at you 1,000 miles an hour, and you got to react the best that you can at any given moment. And to me, that's a life. That's the beauty of real life, of what this is all about here. The beauty of being here and being alive is not the newest technology or the newest fashion. It's dealing with the problems as they come, knowing which problems you can deal with, which ones you can't deal with, and showing that true love to those that you care about by engaging them.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And just to touch on something you said a minute ago, I also have a daughter, and it's important for me to be the type of man that I would feel good about my daughter marrying. Because one of these days, she's going to go out and get married. And when she's looking for what are the qualities of a good man to marry, she's going to be comparing other people to me, right? Hopefully. That's my hope anyway. And so what it is I need to do is I need to make sure that I'm a man, that I'm teaching my family, exercising, those things that I need to make sure that I am showing her what manly attributes really are. Because when she's out looking for a spouse, that's what I want her to be looking for in another man. And to something else that you said, the world that we live in is constantly trying to say it's okay, mediocrity is okay. Participation trophy is good for everybody just because you participated. It doesn't mean anything to be a winner. And so what this does is it erases lines of accountability. When I look towards men that I appreciate and admire, when I look at role models, I wrote another article on role models that landed on somebody else's website maybe about 2 years ago. I think I'm going to repost it on mine. I haven't posted on mine yet. But it's important to find those role models, people that you can model yourself after, because this is an area where I might be lacking and I can do a lot better. And here's a guy that's doing it right. And I need other good, strong men, character driven in my life to help hold me accountable to what it really means to step up when I need to step up and do the types of things I need to do as a man in terms of protecting my family or providing for my family. Laziness is not a manly attribute. And so when it comes time for a man to earn a buck because he knows that his kids are going to be going to school, starting school, next fall, he needs to go out there and he needs to learn what it means to hit the grind, right? And really hustle to bring in a little extra money, because it's up to us as men to make sure that we're doing what we have to do so we can give our families opportunities. This doesn't mean we just, set them up for life so that way they become, one of these Beverly Hills trust fund babies that some of us kind of despise, right? Because they're everything we're not talking about. But it does mean that we have to work hard and hustle for our families. And knowing that there's other men out there that are doing it, those are the type of people that I compare myself to, and I draw my lines of accountability on manliness around things that I know about good men from the past and good men that I see that are out there right now that are doing it right.
I was just listening to David Goggins' interview today, and he was talking about, he said, there's never been an easier time in history to stand out as great. He said, because we're surrounded by mediocrity. And it doesn't take much to excel in this world that we're living in right now, because majority of men, majority of anybody, the moment they get somewhat of discouragement, somebody calls them out on something, somebody yells at them, somebody gives them any sort of friction whatsoever towards the goal that they're going to, and they clam up, they slow down, they slow their roll, and things come to a quick end. Where if you can keep, and it's the same thing with having kids, so you're constantly trying to show them, keep fighting, keep going through, keep working at what you believe in, keep working hard at everything that we do. We got to be putting in our best efforts. We have the little homestead here, so we're always doing chores, and it's always that, we got to excel at this. We got to succeed at this. We got to do the best we can. We failed here. We messed up. Okay, that's fine. Let's do it better next time. We learned some lessons. These are hard lessons to learn sometimes, but we learned them. Let's move on.
And that's right. After 8 years in political office, I was a lawmaker in our Capitol building for 8 years, and it would early on, you win your first campaign, and you think everybody in the world loves you because all these people voted for you, and you just won political office. And you can have the best day in the world, and then you get home at night and you see one little notification on your Facebook page. And it's somebody that's just going to light you up for something you said or one of the votes you took. And it can be really easy to get discouraged and to completely lose track, and you get lost in your own emotions because somebody said something so terrible or negative, or you found out that somebody's working against you in what you're trying to accomplish. But like I put in this most recent blog post, and it's kind of a tenet of the Stoic philosophy. And I encourage men, read from the Bible, read from the book of Proverbs. You want to learn about compassion. There's books you can read from in the Bible about this stuff, but you can also learn a lot from reading from some of these Stoic ancient philosophers. And the whole tenet of this philosophy is really, listen, you've got a limited amount of energy and emotion. Spend it wisely. Put it where it matters. Don't spend it on things that aren't going to make a hill of beans worth of difference in what it is you're going to be able to do or accomplish, or things that you can't influence. Spend your emotion and your energy on the things that matter in your life and where it counts. And I think that what we have in the world that we live in, and this is part of the cultural war, right, against masculinity, walk around on eggshells, put on the soft slippers, because we want you thinking about everybody else, and we want you to get lost in your emotions. Let us know, that you're in touch with this, that you're not, I won't get too political here, but you know what I'm saying? Like the culture is trying to tell men that they're supposed to think a certain way and get lost in the emotion and be able to identify a certain way. And I'm telling you, it's a big lie that men are falling for, because we have people in this world offering up masculinity on the altar of the false gods of things like social justice, and it is defeating us. And as this historian said, it is making us more unwarlike than men at any time in our history, and it's something we have to be ever vigilant of.
No doubt about it. And again, like we were saying earlier, being put to the test and going through some sort of test at some point in your life and getting through the other side and realizing who you are, what's expected of you. For me, sometimes it's really easy to kind of beat up on that younger generation or this generation that I see. I think at times we need to be a little bit better about being an example in a good way, in a smart way, in a mentoring way of helping some of these young guys wake up to the realities. Because, and I go back to the same thing I was listening to today by Goggins, and he was saying, he was talking about how even when I'm running, he says, I'm not running to get ready for some race. I'm running to callous my mind. It's all a mental game. So constantly as I'm running, it's just to build calluses on my mind so I can know that I am stronger than my mind. That when my mind says I've reached a breaking point, I can keep going. And Jordan Peterson says something similar. He said, all this stuff of becoming better, becoming more, like you're talking about, more stoic, more understanding of this stuff, is so that when somebody important in your life dies, that the rest of your family has somebody to rely on, somebody to lean on, somebody that's going to be there and not be the one that completely breaks down, falls apart, and cannot help anybody. And that idea of masculinity, that idea of being the bulwark to protect the family. Like all of us watch all the old movies, and they always had like some grandfather or some patriarch leader in that family that made the decisions, and decisions went through him. But what was his idea? Why was that? Because he was wiser, and he could help. He could be that bulwark that protected those that were under his care. And we've lost so much of that. It's
Plato said, and like to the point you're talking there, like we have to look at ourselves as other people's role models. Like if you want to be a better man, understand that people are watching you to see what masculinity is. And they might not ever tell you, but there's always somebody watching you. Plato said the best way of training the young is to train yourself at the same time, not to admonish them, but to be seen never doing that of which you would admonish them. In other words, lead by example. You have to do that because that time that you're talking about, there's a death in the family. People need to have a rock to lean on, and they need to know that it's possible to be the rock. And one of these days, they might have to step up to be the rock to pull the rest of the family through another loss. And they can only do that when they've seen other men in their family do it. And so we have to understand, we need to know that. We need to have role models in our lives, but we also have to understand that we are also role models for other people, whether we realize it or not. Marcus Aurelius, another good Stoic, the last of the 5 good emperors of Rome. He wrote Meditations, which I highly encourage everybody to read. He said, waste no time in arguing what a good man should be one. In other words, take the initiative, just figure it out, and just study it out. Study out what it means to be a good man. Just take the initiative yourself and just start doing it. Whether or not you have a role model in your life or not, it's up to us to exercise that self-ownership and just be the type of men that we already know we should be. But sometimes, you just got to reflect a little bit. You have to find your path, and that's what Marcus Aurelius is speaking to. This is a great conversation, man. I tell you what, I really enjoy the opportunity to talk with you about this type of stuff.
It's harder and harder to find guys that come on my podcast that want to talk about things like this, Paul. So, no, and to your point there as we get close to wrapping up here is, that was kind of my response to the whole Gillette ad. It should not surprise us anymore what they're doing. That should not bother us really at all because it's nothing new. It's just going to continue. But the best way for us to fight the whole toxic masculinity idea is to be the men that they're fighting against, but to show the true colors and the true nature of it. When you have that niece that says, the way that they would look at my uncle is toxic, but the reality is I've known him since I was a little kid, and he hunts and he fishes, but you know what? I know there's no other man other than my father that loves me as much as that guy. And by being that constant example, especially not just to the young men, but to the young women, that look, I can go hunting, I can go fishing, I can drive around in my old farm truck and wear my curved brim hat, and still these other girls, these other women, these other men as equals, as people that I have respect for, whether I agree with what they're doing or not. I can give them their space, and I can be an example of what it means to truly be a man. So, as we kind of wrap up, I always ask guys a couple of questions. Number one, what's a piece of EDC gear that you never leave home without?
Yeah, well, I always make sure that laws permitting, I'm always within reach of my sidearm. That's second nature to me now. Sometimes I forget, a knife, but I'm a pretty basic guy. No matter where I go, no matter where my family goes, I already know that it's my job to make sure that I am their number one protector, and I am prepared to do that. But I also try to never go anywhere without my manners. And I think that that's something that a lot of men are forgetting these days as well. What it means to hold the door open for a woman, or what it means to just be polite, smile, and say hi to somebody as you pass them on the street, or stand up and let somebody else have your street if you're on a crowded bus or in a crowded room. And so that's something that I want to instill in my kids. And so I make sure that wherever I go, they see me being an absolute gentleman to everybody that we encounter.
Excellent point. That's great. And the second question I always throw out there, Paul, is if you could give a challenge to the men listening to this podcast, something tangible, something that they could start today.
Yeah. What I would tell them to do is either the first thing in the morning or the last thing before they go to bed. I'll give them two things, if I can throw two in here. One, write down just 2 or 3 lines about something that you encountered throughout the day, a challenge, maybe a good quote that you read, and just write a couple lines down about what you thought of it. Maybe you had a big, important decision, and so just write through your decision. Actually, put it on paper. Just do it, just 1 or 2 lines. every night or every morning. And then the second thing is read. Start reading. I'm really big on this. I would be the most powerful man in the world if I could read people's thoughts. Okay? But when you pick up a book and you read it, you're literally reading other people's thoughts. You want to read the thoughts of great men? Pick up the books that they wrote and read them. And I tell you what, I even put this in my article on being a role model. I want my son to see me reading because I want him to develop a real appreciation for it. And so knowing that I'm a role model for him, I just started reading more. And I've read more books in the last year than I probably have in the previous 15. And it's been really, really good for me. And it has really sharpened my mind. And the point of reading is to help us think better. And when you can think better, you live better. When you can think better, you live better, and you're a better man for it. Write down just a few things every morning, every day, and read books.
So, since you brought up, I'll throw out another question. Give us a couple of books then that you highly recommend. I mean, you already recommended the Bible, obviously, and any of the Stoics' work, but what's something else that you've read that really hit you?
Yeah, I'll give you two. One of them is for the world that we live in. There's a book called Deep Work by a guy named Dr. Cal Newport. And he writes about the dangers of social media, not just in terms of, who you might encounter, but how it actually affects your brain. Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, I think it's the first or second chapter where he's talking about what happens to lobsters. When you have a dominant lobster get defeated, their brains practically dissolve and they grow a new subordinate brain. Man, there's a lesson right there in masculinity, fighting to never let yourself become submissive to the rest of the world or the culture. But then another book, and here's one that I really recommend. There's I think he was one of America's first, or at least one of our greatest, World War I fighter pilot aces, a guy named Rickenbacker. And he was a race car driver, and he lost his father at an early age, and his whole life was nothing but a struggle. But here's a guy at 12 years old took correspondence courses in engineering just so he could finally get an apprenticeship in a little tiny garage in Ohio back when vehicles were first becoming popular. And he worked and worked and worked until he finally got to sit in the driver's seat of a car, and he became a famous race car driver. And then they weren't going to let him fly airplanes. And he worked and fought. He joined the military anyway because he wanted to serve his country. And he did everything he could until finally, at a little bit older of an age, they finally let him in the cockpit of a biplane, and he became one of our best fighter aces. And the courage that it took to fly 30,000, 15,000 feet in the air, whatever it was, without a parachute in a new flying machine constructed out of wood and canvas, and put your life on the line, and then put your life on, and then do it loaded down with gunpowder. And the guy was just a real American hero, and he understood freedom. And another book, because men need to understand what liberty is. I have a lot to say on this topic. I won't for the sake of time. People need to go back and study the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence and find out what it means to actually be free. It means that just by virtue of being a man, you're free. And government doesn't give us our rights. Government exists to protect our rights. And if you read a book called The Law by a guy named Frederick Bastiat, it's about 80 pages long, but he talks a lot about freedom in there. He talks about things, and he coins terms like legal plunder, where the government makes things completely illegal for everybody else, but it allows it to be legal for the politicians. And there's a lot of that going on in the world that we live in, and it does nothing but breed corruption. And for the rest of us, it breeds contempt. And so men need to read a little bit about real American heroes. We need to understand a little bit about how our brains work, so deep work would really help. But we also need to understand our freedom, and that when we really understand freedom and liberty, it really drives that sense of personal responsibility home.
Thanks, Paul. I really appreciate you hanging out and talking about masculinity and sharing that story. I really appreciate our conversation, and we'll have to do this again.
It's been good. Really appreciate it. Thanks.
As always, check out the show notes for more information and the links. If you are a regular listener to Ever Vigilant, there are a few ways that you can help this mission advance. Subscribe, share with a friend, leave a review where you listen to this podcast. As always, a big thank you to the members of the Wolfpack for their continued support of this mission. Hold fast, men, and God bless.
For the strength of the pack is the wolf, and the strength of the wolf is the pack.